I never thought I'd end up in a situation where a guy feeding me would be the most memorable part of my week, but here we are. It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, like, oh, this cute volunteer at the animal shelter literally gave me a sandwich. But somehow, it wasn't just about the sandwich. There was something about that afternoon that stuck with me, more than any swipe right or awkward coffee date ever did. So let me back up a bit. I started volunteering at the animal shelter, partly because my weekends were a mess of boredom, and partly because I figured hanging out with dogs and cats was better than binge-watching Netflix alone for the 100th time. The place is this modest, slightly run-down building on the edge of town, with a parking lot that's always half empty and a staff that's equal parts exhausted and passionate. The clients are mostly rescue animals with stories you don't want to hear but can't look away from, and the volunteers are this mix of college kids trying to rack up community service hours and older folks who just really love dogs. That's where I first noticed him, Eli. I didn't know his name right away, of course. At first, he was just the quiet guy who always showed up early, wore these threadbare jeans, and carried this old, beaten-up backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He had this way of moving around the shelter like he belonged there, like the chaos and the barking and the endless cleaning weren't tiring at all. Watching him from across the room, it was clear he was serious about the animals, but also kind of gentle in a way that didn't feel forced or performative. He wasn't the loud, overly enthusiastic type who shouted across the room about how much he loved puppies. He was the kind of guy who, when you saw him with a dog that was scared or broken, just knelt down and let the dog come to him. No rush, no pressure. I was volunteering one Saturday afternoon, and honestly, I was in a bit of a funk. I'd had a rough week at work, and the usual volunteer crew was a little thin that day, so it felt like I was running in circles, trying to keep up. Around mid-afternoon, I found myself sitting in the small staff kitchen, eating a protein bar that tasted like cardboard, and trying not to think about all the emails waiting for me back at my desk. That's when Eli appeared, carrying a brown paper bag. He looked like he'd just come from somewhere else, not the shelter. He smiled, this quick, almost shy grin, and said, "Hey man, you look like you could use this." And then he pulled out a sandwich. Not one of those fancy, Instagram-ready things, just a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, probably made at home. I'm not proud to admit this, but I hesitated a bit. I half expected him to say, "Here, you can have this, but only if you promise to come back and help clean the kennels," or something. But he just shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Thought you might be hungry." I brought extra. That small gesture was somehow more comforting than any pep talk or motivational quote I'd ever gotten. We sat there, eating in silence for a minute, and something about the quiet between us felt easy. The shelter's chaos was muffled, and for a moment, it was just two guys sharing a sandwich in a cramped little kitchen. I remember thinking, I don't even know your name yet, but I want to. That's where things started, but not in a way that screams romance or meet cute. It was just two people, a sandwich, and a shelter full of dogs who needed more love than either of us probably had to give. And somehow, that felt like enough to get things moving. I looked up at him and smiled. The kind of smile where you don't even have to say anything because it's kind of saying all the things. "I'm Mark," I said, sticking out my hand, feeling a little dumb for making it so formal. He took it, firm grip, and said, "Eli." Just like that. No big production, no extra words. We ended up back out in the shelter, each grabbing a leash and heading toward different kennels. I was supposed to walk a hyperactive lab mix named Dexter, but somehow Eli ended up right beside me. He had this way with the dogs that made me think maybe he grew up with a few himself, or worked at a vet clinic or something. Dexter, who usually looked like he wanted to chew through the leash and run a marathon, suddenly calmed down when Eli held out a hand and spoke softly. "You work a lot with anxious dogs, huh?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation casual, even though I really wanted to know everything about him. Eli glanced at me and smiled. "Yeah, I used to. My sister's dog had terrible panic attacks. Took a while to figure out how to help him. Guess I picked up some tricks." I nodded, feeling a little impressed and a little jealous at the same time. There was something in the way Eli talked, Like every story he shared was a small piece of who he really was, and I wanted to hear more. Over the next hour, as we took turns with different dogs and filled water bowls, one found myself opening up too. Not about anything super personal, but enough to feel like I wasn't just some volunteer passing through. I told him about my own crazy work schedule, how this shelter gig was a way to unplug and feel useful. He listened like I was the most interesting thing in the world, which, honestly, I wasn't used to at all. Then came the moment I didn't see coming. We were in the middle of cleaning out a kennel when Eli accidentally dropped a bucket of soapy water. It splashed all over my shoes and pants, and I just stood there, frozen, half expecting to feel annoyed or embarrassed. Instead, Eli burst out laughing, a real, genuine laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Man, I'm so sorry. That was totally my fault," he said, wiping tears from his face. "Guess you're officially part of the shelter now." I laughed too, and something about that little accident broke the ice even more. As the sun started to set, casting a warm glow over the shelter's yard, the rest of the volunteers began packing up. I realized I hadn't felt this light in weeks. Eli and I walked out together, the dogs trotting happily beside us, and the evening air was calm and comfortable. "Hey," I said suddenly, not even sure why I was being so bold. "Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? Maybe not at the shelter, somewhere with less chance of a water bucket attack." He looked over at me, that same shy smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I'd like that." I felt this buzz in my chest, a mix of nerves and excitement. We exchanged numbers, and just like that, the shelter wasn't just a place I volunteered anymore. It was the place where something unexpected had started. That night, I found myself staring at my phone, rereading his texts. He was funny, thoughtful, and most importantly, real. We talked about everything from favorite movies to the dumbest thing we'd ever done. Mine involved an ill-advised attempt at salsa dancing, which he found hilarious. The next weekend, we met up at a little coffee shop Eli recommended. It was cozy, with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. Sitting across from him, watching him laugh over some inside joke, I realized how rare it was to find someone who felt like a safe place without even trying. Over the weeks that followed, volunteering together became our thing. We'd joke about being the dynamic duo of the shelter, teasing each other when the work got tough. But it was more than that. It was a chance to see each other in a way that felt unforced, natural. The way he talked to the animals, the way he checked in with me after a rough day, the way his eyes softened when he caught me staring, it all added up to something I hadn't planned on but didn't want to ignore. One rainy Saturday, after we'd finished feeding and walking the animals, Eli surprised me by pulling out a pack of hot chocolate from his bag. We sat on the shelter's porch, sipping the sweet, steaming drinks, watching the rain blur the world outside. "Thanks for letting me share that sandwich with you," he said quietly. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the cocoa. "Yeah, thanks for feeding me, in more ways than one." He looked at me then, a little hesitant but hopeful, and I knew this was the start of something real. Not just because of sandwiches or shelter dogs, but because sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones that feed your heart the most. From that rainy afternoon on the porch, things between Eli and me started to shift in a way I hadn't fully expected. We moved from casual hangouts to something that felt a lot more charged, I guess. Like there was this unspoken tension underneath every glance, every touch, even in silence. It wasn't the kind of drama you see in movies. No grand declarations or dramatic confrontations, but more like the slow buildup of something genuine. Something that made my chest tighten in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I remember one particular evening, a couple of weeks later. We were closing up the shelter after a long day of cleaning, walking, feeding. The usual. It was just us and a few straggling dogs in the yard. The sun was dipping low, casting this golden light that made everything look softer. Eli was leaning against the fence, twirling a leash around his fingers, and I was trying not to stare at the way the light hit his hair. "Hey," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Yeah. Do you ever think about what comes next? Like, after all this volunteering? After all the chaos?" I hesitated. It was a fair question, but one I hadn't really thought about. Honestly, sometimes I just want to run away from everything for a while. But with you, I don't know. It feels like maybe there's something worth sticking around for. He smiled, a small, almost shy thing that made my heart flip. Good answer. We stood there for a moment, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full, like it's holding something unspoken. Then he surprised me by stepping closer, his voice dropping just a bit. Mark, can I be honest about something? Always. I've been kind of scared to say it out loud because I don't want to mess this up, but I like you, more than just as a friend or a volunteer buddy. I've liked you since that first sandwich. I laughed, the tension breaking like a wave. Well, that makes two of us. And just like that, the space between us closed. The kind of moment you don't plan for, but hope will happen. We didn't rush into anything. No dramatic kiss or confession. Just a quiet, understanding look, and a nervous smile that said, "We're in this together." The next few weeks felt like we were navigating uncharted territory. We were learning how to be more than friends, how to hold hands without feeling awkward, how to sit close without overthinking every move. It was messy and awkward and wonderful all at once. One afternoon, Eli invited me over to his apartment after a shelter shift. It was small, cluttered with books and pictures of dogs, cozy in that lived-in way that makes you feel at home immediately. We cooked dinner together, me trying to keep up with his easy confidence in the kitchen, him laughing when I almost burned the garlic. We ended up sprawled on the couch, half watching a movie neither of us really cared about, talking about everything and nothing. That night, as I left his place, I realized I hadn't felt that comfortable with anyone in a long time. There was no pretense, no pretending to be someone I wasn't. Just us, and that was enough. But, as with anything real, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of doubt, especially for me. I'm not gonna lie, opening up like that was scary. I'd been hurt before, and the idea of putting myself out there felt like standing on a cliff edge, waiting to fall. One evening, after a particularly tough day at work, I found myself snapping at Eli over something stupid, a misplaced coffee cup or a forgotten text message. I can't even remember. He just looked at me quietly and then said, "Hey, it's okay to be scared. You don't have to pretend with me." That simple sentence hit me harder than I expected. I realized I was carrying around this invisible weight, trying to act strong, but what I really needed was someone to just be there. So I started letting him in more, sharing the parts of me I'd kept hidden, the insecurities, the past heartbreaks, the fears. And Eli did the same, telling me about his family, his dreams, the reasons he'd started volunteering at the shelter in the first place. It was messy and sometimes uncomfortable, but it made us closer. We weren't perfect, but we were honest. One day, a few months into all this, we were walking Dexter again, the same hyperactive lab I mentioned earlier. Dexter had this habit of pulling us toward the shelter's old oak tree, a spot where Eli liked to stop and sit. We sat there, the sun warm on our faces, and I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. Eli looked at me, his eyes soft and steady, and said, "You know, I think I'm really lucky to have met you." I smiled, leaning into him. I'm the lucky one. In that moment, surrounded by barking dogs and golden light, none of the messy parts felt so scary anymore. We were just two people, trying to figure things out, feeding each other more than just sandwiches, feeding hope, trust, and maybe even love. For a while after that afternoon by the oak tree, things felt almost effortless between Eli and me. Like we'd found this quiet rhythm where we could just be ourselves without worrying about expectations or pressures. We still volunteered together at the shelter most weekends, sometimes grabbing a bite afterward or just crashing at his place to binge watch terrible TV shows. But, as you probably guessed, life doesn't just hand you perfect moments without a little chaos in the mix. One Saturday, about a month after that walk with Dexter, the shelter was busier than usual. We'd just taken in a litter of kittens from a rescue call, and the whole place was buzzing with volunteers scrambling to clean, feed, and find space. Eli and I were assigned to the cat room, which is normally my favorite corner of the shelter, but that day it felt overwhelming. Between chasing squirming kittens and dealing with a grumpy older cat who'd probably seen one too many new faces, I was wiped out by the time we finished. Eli noticed right away. He caught me as I was leaning against the doorframe, trying to catch my breath and ignore the tight knot forming in my chest. "You okay?" he asked gently. I forced a smile, but I could tell he saw through it. Just tired. It's been a long day. He nodded and handed me a bottle of water. Let's take a break. I know a spot. We walked out to the shelter's small courtyard, a patch of grass surrounded by chain-link fencing and a few scraggly bushes. Eli sat down on the bench and patted the spot beside him. I hesitated but sat down anyway. The shelter can get intense, he said, looking over at me. Sometimes it's hard to separate the animals. Problems from your own. I sighed. Yeah, I think that's why I keep coming back, though. Feels like the only place where some good still happens. He smiled, soft and understanding. I get that, but you gotta take care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup. I knew he was right, but it's hard to admit when you're used to pushing through. Thanks, Eli. I appreciate you looking out for me. He shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. Someone's gotta. We sat there for a while, the breeze stirring leaves around our feet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was okay to admit I was struggling without feeling weak. That evening, Eli asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. I almost said no, thinking I just wanted to be alone. But there was something about him that made me want to say yes. So I did. At his apartment, the lights were dim and warm. He was cooking pasta, humming along to some indie band I didn't recognize. I sat at the kitchen counter, watching him move around with easy confidence. There was a quiet intimacy to it, like we were sharing a moment just for ourselves amidst all the noise life throws at you. We talked about everything. Work, the shelter, our families, the dumb mistakes we'd made in the past. It wasn't heavy or dramatic. It was just real. After dinner, we moved to the couch and he pulled me close. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and it hit me how much I wanted this. Wanted him. Mark, he whispered, fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. I don't want to rush anything, but I want you to know I'm here, for the good days and the bad. That simple promise meant more than I could say. We kissed then, slow and tentative at first, like discovering something new between us. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people finally letting down their walls. After that night, I started opening up more than I ever had before. I told Eli about the times I'd felt invisible, the loneliness that sometimes crept in even when I was surrounded by people. He didn't judge or try to fix me. He just listened, and that made all the difference. One day, a couple of weeks later, we were at the shelter when a little girl came in with her mom. She was about 6 or 7, eyes wide as she looked at the animals. "I want to help," she said shyly, tugging on her mom's sleeve. Eli knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "You want to be a volunteer someday?" She nodded enthusiastically. "That's awesome," he said. "You know, sometimes helping animals means being patient, kind, and not giving up, even when things get tough." I watched as Eli encouraged her, his passion shining through. It struck me how much he cared, not just about the animals, but about people too. Later, as we closed up, I looked at him and realized I didn't just want to be his volunteer buddy anymore. I wanted to be part of whatever he was building, messy and imperfect as it might be. That night, as we said goodnight, I took a deep breath and said, "Eli, I want to keep doing this, us. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to find out with you." He smiled, something tender and relieved in his eyes. "Me too, Mark. Me too." And while the world outside kept spinning in its chaotic way, in that moment, sitting on his doorstep with the night air cool around us, I felt like I'd finally found something steady to hold on to, something worth fighting for. A few weeks after that night on Eli's doorstep, things were settling into a new kind of normal between us. We were still volunteering together, still stealing those quiet moments amid barking dogs and purring cats, but now there was something else. The way our fingers brushed when we passed each other, the inside jokes that only we shared, the way our conversations lingered long after the shelter had closed. One particular afternoon stands out. It was a slow day at the shelter, which meant more time to actually sit and talk instead of running from task to task. We were in the back room sorting donations when Eli paused, holding up a faded towel embroidered with paw prints. "Remember when we found that scared little terrier hiding under the couch last month?" he asked, grinning. I laughed, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Yeah, Dexter was a mess. You were the only one who could get him out without him snapping. Eli's smile softened. It's funny. I used to think volunteering was just about helping the animals. But it's helped me too. You know, with everything. I nodded. Me too. I never really thought I'd find someone who gets it. Then I caught myself and added, I mean, who gets the chaos of shelter life and life in general, right? He laughed, eyes sparkling. Exactly. There was a pause, that comfortable silence, where the world shrinks down to just us, and the soft sounds of the shelter settling for the evening. Then Eli glanced toward the door, his expression shifting just a little. Actually, he said, hesitating, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. That caught me off guard. Oh yeah, what's that? He shifted nervously, scratching the back of his neck. Well, there's this event coming up, a fundraiser for the shelter. It's kind of a big deal. I was thinking, maybe we could go together? I blinked, a smile spreading. You mean, like, a date? He looked down for a second and then back up, eyes hopeful. Yeah, a date. I felt my heart skip. It wasn't like I wasn't feeling this too, but hearing it out loud made it feel real in a way I hadn't fully let myself believe. I'd love that, I said. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the fundraiser. I started wondering about what I would wear, if I'd be awkward in a crowd, if Eli would hold my hand. The nervous excitement was a new sensation, thrilling and terrifying all at once. The day of the event arrived, and Eli swung by to pick me up. He looked different. Cleaner, sure, but also somehow more vulnerable, like he was stepping out of his comfort zone just as much as I was. He opened the car door for me, and I caught the way his fingers lingered on the door handle a moment longer than necessary. The venue was a converted warehouse, decked out with strings of fairy lights and tables with photos of shelter animals and their new homes. There was music low in the background and a quiet buzz of conversation. We slipped in together, Eli's hand finding mine almost without thinking. We spent the evening chatting with other volunteers, sharing stories about the animals, and even bidding on a few auction items. But my attention was mostly on Eli, the way he relaxed as the night went on, the way his eyes lit up when he told a story about a dog he'd fostered, the way his hand never left mine. At one point, as we stood outside on a little balcony overlooking the city lights, Eli turned to me. I'm really glad you said yes to tonight, he said softly. I squeezed his hand. Me too. There was a pause, and then Eli leaned in, brushing his lips against mine. It was gentle, tentative, but full of all the feelings neither of us had said yet. Mark. He whispered against my mouth. I don't know where this is going exactly, but I want to find out with you. I smiled, heart pounding. Same here, Eli. After that night, things deepened. We started spending more time together outside of volunteering. Picnics in the park, lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and late texts, quiet nights at his apartment where we didn't have to pretend to be anyone but ourselves. But it wasn't all easy. One evening, after a long day at work, I caught myself withdrawing, retreating into silence when Eli tried to check in. I wasn't trying to push him away. It was just that old fear creeping back, the one that tells you it's safer to be alone. Eli didn't back down. He sat beside me, arms around my shoulders, steady and patient. Whatever you're dealing with, I'm here, he said quietly. That moment, the quiet reassurance in his voice, was a turning point. I realized that love wasn't about never being scared or perfect. It was about showing up, even when it's hard. Over the next few months, we navigated the usual ups and downs. We had our disagreements, some silly, some serious, but we always came back to that place of honesty and care. One chilly evening as we were leaving the shelter, Eli surprised me with a little package. Inside was a scrapbook he'd been working on quietly, filled with photos of us and the shelter animals, ticket stubs from our outings, and little notes. Thought we could fill this together, he said, smiling. I felt my throat tighten, overwhelmed by how much he cared. As we walked away hand in hand, I realized that sometimes the best things come from the simplest moments. A sandwich shared in a cramped kitchen, a quiet walk with the dog, and someone willing to feed you in more ways than one. The scrapbook sat on Eli's coffee table, a quiet testament to the little world we'd built together. Every time I flipped through its pages, I was reminded how far we'd come from that first awkward, here have a sandwich moment in the shelter kitchen. One Saturday morning, a few months after Eli gave me that scrapbook, We were volunteering like usual, feeding the animals, cleaning kennels, and trying to keep up with the endless energy of the shelter dogs. The sun was streaming through the windows in golden beams, and there was a calmness to the chaos that felt almost peaceful. We took a break and sat out in the courtyard, Dexter at our feet, panting happily. Eli pulled out 2 steaming cups of coffee from his backpack, handing me one without a word. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the cup between my hands, but more than that, feeling the quiet certainty of us. "Mark," Eli said softly, his eyes catching the sunlight in a way that made me pause. "I was thinking, maybe it's time to make things official. Not just volunteering or dating, but us. Together." I looked at him then, heart full and steady. I'd like that, more than anything. We didn't need grand declarations or dramatic moments. Just that simple, honest truth between us. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder as the dogs barked and played around us. In that moment, everything felt right. Messy, real, and entirely ours. Looking back, I realized that the shelter was never just about the animals. It was the place where I found connection, where 2 people who'd once been cautious with their hearts learned to trust again. It was where a sandwich led to friendship, and friendship grew into love. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A small gesture, a shared moment, and the courage to let someone in. As Eli squeezed my hand, I knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, I was excited about what came next. Because I wasn't alone anymore. And honestly, that felt like the best rescue of all.